The auction block smelled like old wood and shame. 47 people stood in the dirt yard outside the Meridian County Courthouse, watching as children were led forward one by one. Not livestock, not land deeds. Children. Orphans from the territorial home that had burned down 3 weeks prior, leaving 32 souls with nowhere to go and no names anyone cared to remember. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd like a preacher selling salvation. Lot 17, girl, age approximately 12, good health, no known kin, useful for kitchen work, mending, general labor. The girl stood on the wooden platform, her arms wrapped tight around her own waist, as if holding herself together. Her dress was too large, faded gray cotton that hung off her thin shoulders like a burial shroud. Her hair, dark and tangled, fell across her face, but it didn't hide the trembling in her jaw or the way her hands shook against her ribs. She didn't look up. Not at the crowd, not at the auctioneer, not at the sky. Her lips moved, barely a whisper, but the words carried in the terrible silence between the auctioneer's sentences. Nobody picked me. A woman in the front row leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her gloved hand. They both looked at the girl, then looked away. A rancher near the back spat into the dust and shook his head. 2 men in Sunday coats examined her like they might examine a plow, assessing weight, usefulness, cost. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Do I hear an opening bid? $5. Come now, folks, strong girl won't eat much. Silence. The girl's breathing quickened. Her fingers dug into her own arms, nails pressing white crescents into her skin. She whispered again, quieter this time, like a prayer no one was meant to hear. Please, somebody. A man in the third row scratched his beard and frowned. Another turned his back entirely and started walking toward the road. The auctioneer's smile thinned. $4 then, $4 for a willing worker. She'll earn it back in a season. Still nothing. The girl's knees buckled slightly. She caught herself, straightening with a desperate, humiliated effort. Her head dropped lower, her shoulders curled inward. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the wood beneath her feet. Nobody picked me, she whispered again. Nobody ever picks me. The auctioneer sighed, irritation creeping into his voice. $3, final offer. Otherwise she goes to the workhouse in Caldwell, and I don't need to tell you folks what that means. The workhouse, a place where orphans went to vanish, where children worked until their hands bled and their names were forgotten. Everyone knew, no one spoke. The girl's trembling turned into shaking. Her whole body quaked. She wrapped her arms tighter, folding into herself like a wounded bird. And then, a voice. Quiet, steady, barely louder than the wind. $10. Every head turned. At the far edge of the crowd, leaning against a weathered fence post, stood a man. Tall, lean, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. Dust covered his boots and the hem of his coat. He didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there, one hand resting on the post, the other hanging loose at his side. The auctioneer blinked. I'm sorry, did you say? $10, the man repeated. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like gravel scraped across iron. For the girl. Silence rippled through the crowd. A few people turned to stare, others whispered. The auctioneer recovered quickly, his smile returning like a snake uncoiling. Well now, $10, that's a generous bid, sir, going once. Wait, a woman's voice, sharp and suspicious. She stepped forward, a pale blue dress swishing around her ankles. Her face was narrow, pinched with distrust. Who are you? I don't recognize you. The man didn't answer, didn't even look at her. The woman's eyes narrowed. We don't just hand children over to strangers. What's your name? Where's your land? Still, the man said nothing. He shifted his weight slightly, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the courthouse, beyond the girl on the platform. The auctioneer hesitated, his grin faltering. Ma'am, a bid's a bid, if the man's got the money. I want to know who he is, the woman insisted, her voice rising. You can't just let some drifter walk off with a child. The man finally moved. Slowly, he pushed away from the fence post and walked forward. His boots crunched softly in the dirt. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, close enough now that the girl on the platform could see him clearly for the first time. He was older than she'd thought, lines etched deep around his eyes. A scar ran along his jaw, faded white against weathered skin. His hands were rough, calloused, the hands of someone who'd worked hard and long and without complaint. He reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and tossed it onto the auctioneer's table. It landed. D with a heavy clink. "There's 10, the man said quietly. "Count it if you want." The auctioneer opened the pouch, fingers moving quickly through the coins. His eyes widened slightly. He nodded. "It's all here." The man turned his gaze to the girl. For the first time since stepping onto that platform, she looked up. Their eyes met. His were pale gray, like storm clouds over distant mountains. Tired, sad, but not cruel, not cold. He spoke directly to her, ignoring everyone else. "You got a name." The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. She swallowed hard, tried again. "Ivy," she whispered. "My name's Ivy." The man nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Mine's Caleb." He paused, his voice softening. "You're mine now, Ivy, not for labor, not for kitchen work." He looked at the auctioneer, then back at her. "Mine forever." The girl, Ivy, stared at him, her trembling slowed, her breath caught in her chest. She didn't understand, didn't know what he meant, but something in his voice, in the weight of that word, forever, made her knees stop shaking. The auctioneer clapped his hands together, eager to move on. "Sold, then, lot 17 to the gentleman for $10. Next up, lot 18. But Caleb was already walking toward the platform. He climbed the steps slowly, his boots heavy on the wood. When he reached Ivy, he didn't grab her, didn't pull her along like property. He just held out his hand. "Come on," he said quietly, "let's go home." Ivy stared at his hand, rough, scarred, open. She hesitated. Then, with shaking fingers, she reached out and placed her small hand in his. His grip was warm, steady. He led her down from the platform, past the staring crowd, past the whispering women and the suspicious men. No one stopped them. No one said a word. As they walked toward the road, Ivy glanced back once at the courthouse, at the other children still waiting on the platform, at the faces that had turned away from her. Nobody picked me, she thought. But somebody did. They rode in silence. Caleb's horse, a sturdy roan mare named Dust, carried them both slowly down the rutted dirt road leading out of Meridian. Ivy sat in front of him, stiff and small, her hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles went white. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't cry. She just held on. Behind them, the town shrank into the distance, swallowed by dust and heat haze. The land opened wide, rolling plains of dry grass, scattered oak trees, mountains bruised purple on the horizon. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Caleb adjusted his hat to cast shade over Ivy's face. After an hour, he spoke. "You thirsty?" Ivy nodded, barely. Caleb reined Dust to a stop near a cluster of cottonwoods where a thin creek trickled through the rocks. He dismounted first, then lifted Ivy down carefully, his hands steady under her arms. She landed lightly, still not meeting his eyes. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. "Drink slow." She obeyed, tilting the canteen to her lips. The water was warm but clean. She drank 3 swallows, then stopped and handed it back. "More," Caleb said. She shook her head. "Ivy," his voice was firm but not harsh, "drink more." She took the canteen again, drank 2 more swallows, then handed it back. This time he accepted it. They stood in the shade, the only sounds the creek's murmur and the occasional rustle of leaves. Ivy stared at the ground, her fingers twisting the fabric of her oversized dress. Finally, she whispered, "Why did you pick me?" Caleb crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees so he was closer to her height. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. sadness, recognition. "You don't remember me," he said quietly. Ivy's head snapped up, her eyes widened. "What?" Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object. He held it out in his open palm. A wooden horse, hand-carved, smooth from years of handling. One ear was chipped. The tail was slightly crooked. Ivy's breath stopped. She knew that horse. Her hand moved without thinking, reaching out, fingers hovering just above the worn wood. Her voice cracked. "Where did you get that?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I made it 8 years ago for a little girl who lived on a homestead near Crowley Pass." He paused. Her name was Ivy. The world tilted. Ivy staggered back a step, shaking her head. "No, no, her voice broke. "That was before the fire, before they—" "I know," Caleb said. "I was there." The words landed like stones. Ivy's face drained of color. Her hands started trembling again, worse than before. "You were there." Her voice rose, sharp with panic. "You were there." Caleb stood slowly, his expression heavy with something that looked like guilt. "I worked for your father, just for a season, helped him build that barn, mend fences, break horses." He looked down at the wooden toy in his hand. "You used to follow me around, asking 100 questions, so I carved this for you." Ivy's breathing turned ragged. Memories flickered, half-formed, painful. A tall man with kind eyes, her father laughing, a barn, smoke. "Then you know," she whispered, her voice raw. "You know what happened." Caleb nodded, slow and heavy. "I know." "Then why didn't you stop it?" The words tore out of her, jagged and desperate. "Why didn't you do something?" Caleb's face hardened, not with anger but with the weight of old shame. "Because I wasn't there when it mattered." His voice was rough, barely controlled. "I'd moved on to another job 2 counties over. I didn't hear about the fire until 3 days after." He paused, his hands curling into fists. "By the time I rode back, the homestead was ash. Your parents were buried, and you were gone." Ivy's knees buckled. She sank down onto the dirt, her hands pressing against her face. "They said it was an accident," she choked out. "They said the lantern fell." Caleb crouched beside her again, his voice low and steady. "It wasn't an accident." Ivy's hands dropped. She stared at him, eyes red and wide. "What?" "There was a man," Caleb continued, his tone darkening. "Name was Voss. He wanted your father's land, prime water access, good grazing. Your father wouldn't sell, so Voss waited until I was gone, then rode out there with 2 hired men." He swallowed hard. "They set the fire, made it look like an accident. No witnesses, no proof." Ivy's whole body shook. "Why didn't you tell someone? Why didn't you?" "I tried," Caleb interrupted, his voice cracking. "I went to the sheriff, to the county marshal, but Voss had money, influence. They said I was a drifter with no evidence, just accusations." His fists clenched tighter. "They told me to move on, so I did." Silence. Heavy, suffocating. Ivy's voice was barely audible. "You left." "I did," Caleb admitted, and the words sounded like a confession. "And I've regretted it every day since." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Then why come back now? Why pick me?" Caleb held out the wooden horse again. "Because I've been looking for you for 8 years," he said quietly. "I checked every orphanage, every workhouse, every town between here and the territory line, and when I heard about the auction today, I knew." He placed the toy gently in her hand. "I knew it was you." Ivy stared down at the horse, her fingers closing around it. "You think giving me a toy makes it better?" Her voice was sharp, cutting. "You think that fixes what happened?" "No," Caleb said simply. "It doesn't." "Then what do you want from me?" Caleb stood, his shadow falling across her. "Nothing. I don't want anything from you, Ivy." He looked out toward the horizon. "I just want to give you what I couldn't before. A home, safety, a place where you don't have to be afraid." Ivy's breath hitched. She squeezed the wooden horse tighter, feeling the worn edges press into her palm. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "I know, but I'm asking you to try." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust and years of buried grief. "Why?" Caleb's voice softened, almost breaking. Because you deserved better then, and you deserve better now. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ivy stood, slowly, clutching the wooden horse to her chest. She didn't smile, didn't forgive, but she didn't run. "Okay," she whispered. Caleb exhaled, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Okay." They reached Caleb's homestead just before sunset. It wasn't much, a small cabin tucked into a valley, surrounded by scrub oak and tall grass that swayed in the evening wind. A modest barn stood nearby, weathered but solid. A chicken coop, a vegetable garden that looked recently tended. Smoke curled from the chimney, lazy and warm. Ivy slid down from the horse, her legs unsteady after hours of riding. She stared at the cabin, her expression unreadable. Caleb dismounted and led Dust toward the barn. "Go inside," he said over his shoulder. "There's bread and dried meat on the table. Help yourself." Ivy hesitated, then walked slowly toward the cabin. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was simple, clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth with a fire crackling low. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars of preserves, dried herbs, a few books. A bed in the corner, neatly made. A smaller cot beside it, also made up, as if waiting. She stood in the center of the room, holding the wooden horse, and for the first time in years felt something that wasn't fear. Not safety, not yet, but the faint possibility of it. Outside, Caleb tended to Dust, brushing her down and filling her trough. The evening settled around him, quiet and familiar. He'd lived alone here for 6 years, ever since he'd stopped drifting and decided to put down roots. It was peaceful, isolated. Zaver. Or it had been. The sound reached him before he saw anything, hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast. Caleb's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. Dust clouds rose in the distance, coming from the direction of town. 3 riders. Caleb's jaw tightened. He walked quickly back to the cabin, pushing the door open. Ivy was sitting at the table, a piece of bread in her hand, her eyes wide at his sudden entrance. "Get in the back room," Caleb said, his voice calm but firm. "Don't come out unless I call you." "What's wrong?" Ivy's voice trembled. "Just do it, now." She obeyed, slipping into the small back room and closing the door behind her. Caleb grabbed his rifle, checked the load, and stepped back outside. He stood in front of the cabin, feet planted, rifle held loose but ready. The 3 riders came into view, slowing as they approached. Caleb recognized the man in front immediately. Vazu. He looked older than Caleb remembered, graying at the temples, heavier around the middle, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating. Voss reined his horse to a stop 10 yards from the cabin. The 2 men flanking him were younger, hired hands by the look of them. One had a revolver on his hip. The other carried a shotgun across his saddle. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Caleb Frost, heard you were back in the area." Caleb didn't move. "Voss. Didn't expect to see you at the auction today." Voss leaned forward in his saddle, his smile widening. "Especially didn't expect you to walk away with county property." "She's not property," Caleb said quietly. "She's a child." "Semantics," Voss waved a hand dismissively. "Point is, people are talking, wondering why a man with no family suddenly buys an orphan girl, wondering what his intentions are." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "My intentions are my business." "Not when it concerns the community," Voss countered smoothly. "See, we have standards here, rules. Can't just let anyone take in a child without proper oversight." "You mean without your approval?" Voss's smile faded. "Careful, Frost." "Or what?" Caleb's voice was steel. "You'll burn down my home too." The air went cold. Voss's eyes narrowed. The 2 men behind him shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. "That's a dangerous accusation," Voss said slowly. "It's the truth," Caleb replied, and we both know it. For a moment, no one moved. The wind rustled through the grass. The horses stamped and snorted. Then Voss laughed, a short, sharp sound. You've got no proof, never did, just the bitter ramblings of a drifter who couldn't mind his own business. He straightened in his saddle. But I'm a reasonable man, Frost, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring that girl back to town tomorrow. You're going to tell the county clerk you made a mistake, and you're going to ride on like you should have years ago. Caleb didn't blink, no. Voss's expression hardened. Then you're going to regret it. Maybe, Caleb said, but not as much as you will. Voss's hand moved toward his belt. And then, a voice, older, rough, coming from the tree line to the left. That's far enough, Voss. Everyone turned. An old man stepped out from behind an oak tree, a rifle resting on his shoulder. He was thin, weathered, with a grey beard and sharp eyes. Behind him, two more figures emerged, ranch hands by the look of them, armed, watchful. Voss's face twisted. This doesn't concern you, Harlan. Sure it does, the old man, Harlan said evenly. Caleb here helped me pull a calf out of a ravine last spring. Didn't ask for payment, didn't ask for anything. He spat into the dirt. So when I saw you and your boys riding out here with that look on your faces, figured I'd come see what the fuss was about. One of the ranch hands beside Harlan spoke up, his voice calm. Heard some interesting stories today, Voss, about a fire 8 years back, about a family that wouldn't sell. Voss's jaw clenched. You don't know what you're talking about. Maybe, Harlan said, but I know I don't like the way you do business, and I know a lot of folks around here don't either. The tension stretched tight. Voss stared at Caleb, then at Harlan, then at the two armed men behind him. His hand moved away from his belt. This isn't over, Voss said quietly. Yeah, Caleb replied, it is. Voss yanked his horse's reins and turned sharply. His two men followed. They rode off into the dusk, dust rising in their wake. Harlan walked over to Caleb, lowering his rifle. You all right? Caleb nodded, thanks. Don't mention it, Harlan glanced toward the cabin, that the girl. Yeah. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good, she deserves better than Voss's world. Caleb looked at him, how'd you know to come? Harlan grinned, showing missing teeth. Heard you paid $10 for a kid at auction. Figured you had a reason. Figured Voss would have a problem with it. He clapped Caleb on the shoulder. You're not alone out here, Frost. Remember that. Caleb watched as Harlan and his men disappeared back into the trees. He stood there for a long moment, the rifle heavy in his hands. Then he turned and walked back into the cabin. Ivy was standing in the doorway of the back room, her face pale. Is he gone? She whispered. Caleb nodded. He's gone. Will he come back? Caleb set the rifle down, his expression hard. Probably. Ivy's hands trembled. Then what do we do? Caleb looked at her, this small, frightened girl who'd been failed by everyone who should have protected her. We stand our ground, he said quietly, together. The days that followed were strange. Not bad, not good, just strange. Ivy moved through the cabin like a ghost, quiet and watchful, never quite settling. She helped where she could, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, feeding the chickens, but she never spoke unless spoken to, never smiled, never let her guard down. Caleb didn't push, he just worked. Every morning he rose before dawn and went out to mend fences, chop wood, tend the garden. Every evening he came back covered in dust and sweat, washed up at the basin, and set out a simple meal. He always made enough for two, always set a plate in front of Ivy, even when she barely touched it. He didn't ask her questions, didn't try to make her talk. He just let her be. On the third night, Ivy finally spoke. Why do you live alone? Caleb looked up from the stew he was stirring. Ivy sat at the table, the wooden horse clutched in her lap. He considered the question, got tired of moving, wanted a place that was mine. Do you have family? Not anymore. What happened to them? Caleb's hand stilled on the ladle. Lost them a long time ago. Fever took my wife and son in the same winter. He looked at her. That's when I started drifting. Didn't see the point in staying put. Ivy was quiet for a moment. What changed? Caleb ladled stew into 2 bowls and set one in front of her. I got tired of running from ghosts. Ivy stared down at her bowl. Do the ghosts ever go away? No, Caleb said honestly, but you learn to live with them. She picked up her spoon, stirred the stew, didn't eat. I dream about the fire, she whispered, every night. Caleb sat down across from her. I know. I hear my mother screaming. I see my father trying to get back inside. Her voice cracked, and I can't move. I just stand there and watch. Caleb's chest tightened. You were a child, Ivy. There was nothing you could have done. Maybe, she said, but I still feel like I should have. He understood that, the weight of helplessness, the guilt that logic couldn't erase. I dream about them too, Caleb said quietly. My wife, my son, I dream I'm back in that cabin and I can save them this time, but I never can. He paused. So I wake up, and I keep going, because that's all we can do. Ivy looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. Does it get easier? No, Caleb admitted, but you get stronger. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then picked up her spoon and took a small bite of stew. It was the first real meal she'd eaten since arriving. Caleb didn't comment. He just ate his own stew, letting the silence settle between them, no longer heavy but shared. 2 days later, Caleb was in the barn repairing a broken harness when Ivy appeared in the doorway, holding something in her hands. What's this? She asked. Caleb looked up. She was holding an old, battered book, a collection of folktales he'd picked up years ago in a trading post. Stories, he said, from different places, Ireland mostly. Ivy opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Can you read? Some. Can you teach me? Caleb set down the harness. You don't know how. Ivy shook her head. They didn't teach us at the orphanage, said we didn't need it. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's a damn shame. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked over to her. Come on. They sat outside in the shade of the cabin, the book open between them. Caleb pointed to the first line, sounding out the words slowly. Ivy listened, her eyes wide, her attention fierce. Repeat after me, Caleb said. She did, stumbling at first, then gaining confidence. They spent the afternoon that way, the sun moving across the sky, shadows lengthening around them. Caleb was patient, never frustrated, never harsh, and Ivy, cautious, guarded Ivy, began to relax. Not all the way, not yet. But enough. That evening, as the light faded and the fire crackled in the hearth, Ivy sat at the table, carving something with a small knife Caleb had given her. He watched from the corner of his eye as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she held it up. A wooden bird, rough, uneven, but recognizable. For you, she said quietly. Caleb took it, turning it over in his hands. It's good. It's crooked. So's mine, he said, nodding toward the wooden horse she still kept in her pocket. Ivy almost smiled, almost. Caleb set the bird on the mantel, next to a seaked mug and a rusted horseshoe. Thank you, he said. Ivy looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, something fragile and tentative. You're not like the others, she said. What others? The people who were supposed to take care of me. They all wanted something, work, money, obedience. She paused. You don't want anything. Caleb met her eyes. I want you to be safe. I want you to be able to grow up without being afraid all the time. He paused. That's all. Ivy's voice was barely a whisper. Why? Caleb's throat tightened. Because I couldn't save your parents, but I can save you. The words hung in the air, raw and true. Ivy's eyes filled with tears, but this time she didn't look away. Okay, she whispered. Caleb nodded. Okay. If you're still with me, take a breath. Think about this. What would you have done in Caleb's place? Would you have walked away 8 years ago, or would you have fought harder? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're wondering how this ends, tap subscribe so you don't miss it. Tell me what time it is where you're reading from. I'd love to know. The peace lasted 6 days. On the 7th morning, Harlan rode up to the cabin at dawn, his face grim. Caleb stepped outside, rifle in hand. What is it? Voss, Harlan said. He's been talking, stirring up trouble in town, saying you're unfit to care for a child. He's got the county clerk convinced to hold a hearing. Caleb's jaw clenched. When? Tomorrow noon. Harlan dismounted, his expression hard. He's going to try to take her back, Caleb. Inside the cabin, Ivy stood frozen by the window, listening. Caleb turned to Harlan. What do I do? You show up, Harlan said, and you bring people who'll vouch for you, folks who know you're a decent man. I don't know many people. You know me, Harlan said, and I know others will be there. Caleb nodded slowly. All right. Harlan clapped him on the shoulder. Don't let that bastard win. The next day, Caleb and Ivy rode into Meridian. The courthouse steps were crowded. Townsfolk gathered, whispering, watching. Voss stood near the entrance, arms crossed, a smug smile on his face. Caleb helped Ivy down from the horse. She clung to his hand, her face pale. Stay close, he murmured. They walked up the steps together. Inside, the hearing room was packed. The county clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat behind a desk. Voss stood to one side, flanked by his 2 hired men. Caleb and Ivy stood on the other. The clerk cleared his throat. This hearing is to determine whether Caleb Frost is a suitable guardian for the minor, Ivy, formerly of the territorial orphanage. He looked at Voss. Mr. Voss, you've raised concerns. State them. Voss stepped forward, his voice smooth. Your Honor, Mr. Frost is a drifter with no family, no ties to this community, and no stable income. He lives alone in an isolated cabin, and his sudden interest in adopting a child is suspicious. Murmurs rippled through the room. The clerk looked at Caleb. Mr. Frost, how do you respond? Caleb's voice was steady. I own my land outright. I have livestock, crops and savings. I'm not a drifter. I've lived here 6 years. He paused. And I didn't adopt Ivy on a whim. I knew her family. I owe them a debt. What kind of debt? The clerk asked. Before Caleb could answer, the door at the back of the room swung open. Harlan walked in, followed by a dozen men and women, ranch hands, neighbors, townsfolk. They filed into the room, filling the empty spaces, standing shoulder to shoulder. The clerk blinked. What is this? Harlan stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. We are here to speak for Caleb Frost. Voss's face darkened. This is irregular. This is a community, Harlan interrupted, and we have a right to speak. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead. One by one, they spoke. Caleb helped me repair my barn after the storm, didn't ask for a cent. He pulled my boy out of a frozen creek last winter, saved his life. He's a good man, quiet but good. Better than most. Ivy watched, her eyes wide, as person after person stood and vouched for Caleb. She'd never seen anything like it. Finally, Harlan spoke again, and as for Voss's concerns about Caleb's character, he turned to face Voss directly. I think we should talk about the fire that killed Ivy's parents, the one that cleared the way for Voss to buy their land. The room went silent. Voss's face flushed red. You have no proof. I have a witness, Harlan said. One of your hired men got drunk last week and started talking. He's willing to testify. Voss's expression crumbled. The clerk leaned forward. Is this true? Voss opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and shoved his way through the crowd, storming out of the courthouse. The clerk watched him go, then looked at Caleb. Mr. Frost, it seems the objection has been withdrawn. He cleared his throat. I see no reason to remove the child fro. Your care. This hearing is concluded. Relief flooded through Caleb. He looked down at Ivy. She stared up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You're staying," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. They rode home in the golden light of late afternoon. Ivy sat in front of Caleb, leaning back against him, her small body finally relaxed. "They stood up for you," she said softly. "They stood up for us," Caleb corrected. Ivy was quiet for a moment, then she asked, "Do you think my parents would have liked you?" Caleb's throat tightened. "I hope so." "I think they would have," Ivy said. "I think they'd be glad you found me." Caleb didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded. Weeks turned into months. Ivy learned to read. She helped Caleb plant a new garden in the spring. She carved more wooden animals, lining them up on the mantel beside the bird and the horse. She still had nightmares, still woke up crying sometimes. But Caleb was always there. A year later, on a cool autumn morning, Caleb and Ivy stood at the edge of the valley, looking out over the land. "I want to plant a tree," Ivy said. "What kind?" "An oak for my parents." Caleb nodded. "We'll plant it today." They did. Together, they dug the hole, set the sapling, and packed the earth around it. Ivy stood back, her hands dirty, her face peaceful. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb put a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," Ivy insisted. She looked up at him. "You gave me a home, you gave me a family." Caleb's eyes burned. "You gave me the same." Ivy smiled, a real, genuine smile. For the first time in 8 years, Caleb felt the weight lift. Not all the way, the ghosts were still there. But they were quieter now. Years later, when Ivy was grown and had a family of her own, she would return to that valley. She would stand beneath the oak tree, now tall and strong, and she would remember. The auction block, the trembling, the fear. And the quiet cowboy who'd stood at the edge of the crowd and said, "Mine, forever." Not as a claim, but as a promise. And he'd kept it.